Good afternoon. My name is Sam Jones, president of the Heartland Initiative, and I'd like to begin with a sincere thank you to the Montreal Institute for the invitation to participate in the forum. And in the spirit of getting to the heart of the matter, the heart being human rights, I'm going to keep my introductory remarks relatively brief. My assumption is that many of you may not yet have seen Navigating the Surveillance Technology Ecosystem, a human rights due diligence guide for investors. It's developed in partnership by Heartland, Access Now, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, Agentura.ru, Gulf Center for Human Rights, Internet Freedom Foundation, Paradigm Initiative, and R3D. With that in mind, I'm going to kick us off by answering three basic questions surrounding the guide: the why, the how, and the what. So, why did we develop the guide? The simple answer is that, like so many others, we were horrified by the human cost of surveillance technologies. The steady stream of reports describing how spyware facilitated the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, the mass surveillance and internment of the minority Uyghur community in China, the inherent bias in facial recognition against communities of color, and the overall autocratizing effect of unregulated, targeted, and mass surveillance on countries around the world all pointed to one of the greatest human rights challenges of our time. So when Citizen Lab convened an event in Toronto in 2020, we began asking ourselves, how can we be useful in the space we occupy between the human rights and investor communities? While policymakers struggle to develop an adequate regulatory response to the many dangers of surveillance tech, we felt that there was an urgent need and opportunity for investors to contribute to the effort to advance corporate accountability in this sector. In light of how pervasive surveillance tech has become in impacting our individual and collective lives and rights, we felt that there was a need to focus attention on the many and often unexpected ways these technologies show up in investment portfolios, creating human rights and other material risks for investors. So how did we develop the guide? Working closely with our partners, we set out to develop a practical tool that enables investors to effectively engage companies and make rights-respecting decisions related to their portfolios. Throughout the process, we struggled with balancing, one, a rights-based approach grounded in the UN guiding principles on business and human rights; two, sufficiently sophisticated research and analysis of an industry that depends on the complexity of its products and services for avoiding accountability; and three, investor need for a pragmatic methodology they can use in limited interaction with portfolio companies. We've now conducted 3 virtual workshops, performed numerous interviews, and conducted extensive research with an array of leading digital rights advocates, due diligence modeling experts, and investors over nearly 2 years to arrive here. The real proof, though, will be in how effective we, as civil society and investors, are in advancing rights-respecting corporate behavior in this risk-fraught sector through the use of the guide. That process has already begun as we're field testing the guide with 6 investor-led engagements with companies with varying degrees of targeted or mass surveillance-related risks. And finally, what is the guide? What we've produced is a tool that can be used by investors of all sizes, types, and geographies to navigate the surveillance technology ecosystem and strengthen their human rights due diligence. Importantly for this conversation, it can also be used by civil society organizations to better understand the material risks associated with surveillance tech, the key business model components of these companies, and the process by which investors make decisions. In doing so, our civil society colleagues can more effectively focus their advocacy efforts and enlist new allies from the investment community. The guide includes an examination of how surveillance technologies create human rights risks for individuals and communities, an explanation of material risks for investors, questions to identify severity of risk, and a framework for investment decision making. With the most important of those 4 objectives in mind, the responsibility to address human rights risks for individuals and communities, I'd like to turn the mic over to our dear friend and colleague, Laura Okkonen, investor advocate for Access Now.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you for the kind invite to join you for this discussion and for moderating the next panel. I would like to introduce to you our two panelists, Nardine Alnemr from the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra, and Danny Rayman from Business and Human Rights Resource Center. I will start with Danny. As Sam alluded, the guide was produced by civil society as a civil society led initiative to guide the investor community. But in addition to what Sam was saying, do you see that there could also be additional value for the civil society to use the guide? And if so, would you mind elaborating on these possibilities from your perspective?
And thanks, Laura, for the question, and also thank you, Sam, for highlighting all what you say about the guide. I think it is important to have, like, as a first point, that the main purpose of the guide was to assist investors conducting human rights due diligence in companies with activities or investment in surveillance technology. However, we have also to understand that we have to better understand private actors, and as civil society um, can start to also take into account that among private actors are different actors, and one of them are, for example, investors. That led us in a better position. So from that point, I can say that one of the additional value for civil society is that we can and have the opportunity to start think in the relation between investors and the direct manufacturers or service providers regarding to these kind of technologies that has so high human cost, right, as Sam mentioned. So in that sense, what I can say is that if we start to consider why investors should be considered when we analyze and also think about how the technologies are having harms, and how we can also work with them to start to consider the UN guiding principles to um, better support also their human rights due diligence, and also that investors communities start to think in human rights when they're participating in these kind of technologies. And also, I think it's important to understand and to think about how this guide was developed. In this guide, there was many voices that were here when this guide was developed. And if we consider that, we can also understand that the guide also consider, for example, certain steps or key sectors from investors that are also are important to them when they saw their activities, right? And in this sense, it's also a value for civil society to understand the different layers that we have to consider when we document and monitor rights harms, and also the role of civil society that could have when it collaborate with private actors to improve their human rights policies, their human rights due diligence process, and also in the provision to access to remedy that these private actors could give to person that could be harmed, right?
Thank you, Danny. That's a really, really, really good start onto our discussion. I want to dig a little bit deeper onto our topic, and also bring in Nardine for the next one together with you, Danny. So if we look at the investor community landscape and responsible business conduct, there's a whole range of different ESG indices and the related climate targets spreading like wildfire to support the investor community in guiding their investment decisions. So, what, in your opinion, how is this guide different from all the other guidance that's pouring into the investor community? What makes it unique? I would again like to ask this question from you both. Perhaps start with you, Danny, and then continue with Nardine, if that's okay.
So I think that so a little bit connected with the previous answer, right? That so the guides provide definitions, examples of current and evolving risks, and also consider question of three key areas for investors, and not just provide these questions for these three key areas, but it's also try to provide some so understanding to how to identify the severity of the risk according to the answers that the investors can provide. And in this sense, the language used on the guide is not only useful and understandable for investor, but it also provides so a common language that could be used for civil society when they have to, and this is important to highlight, right? The importance that civil society start also to engage with investors, communities, and investors to also work together to so elevate the human rights standards among the industry, right? So I think that is it's something really important. And if we consider these layers that you can also find in the different supply chains, or if we consider that for example, if we see this guide, it's elaborate the questions, not only consider, for example, remedy, but also the product cycle life, and that also provides to civil society a better understanding of the different stage and the key sectors that investor has to look when they, for example, conduct a human rights due diligence process, right?
Thank you, Danny. That's super helpful. Nardine, do you have anything to build on from Danny's response? Would you like to comment?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing to really highlight here is that we've had consistent investor input throughout the span of the development of this due diligence model, and this is the guide. And so this is one of the things that we really need to highlight, because it establishes, on the one hand, the expectations from the human rights civil society of the investors, and at the same time, it speaks to the investors in their language, and also sets some standards that they're already relevant, that they're already familiar with. And I think in a way, this is to put it in a bigger framework of business accountability, as we do with anti-slavery practices, as we do with climate change adaptability practices and guidances. I think one of the reasons why it's really important to highlight this collaborative effort is that not only that we create a common language and a common ground for coalescing, collecting, and validating the evidence, and listening to the human rights civil society organizations and what they have to say about the three parts of the guide across governance and practices, the product life cycle, where you could actually detect that it might not be, because the focus is dual use technology, it might not be in the initial packaging or marketing of the product. It could be in another part of the product life cycle, as well as with remedy, because who else would be able to define what it is to make amends if it's not the affected communities themselves? So with all of these put together, I think what this the project of this guide is to actually advance something that is not just about rubber stamping or a ceremonial position of a human rights officer with investors that can, with the surveillance companies that are, the cybersecurity companies that are selling these surveillance technologies, but actually an effective and authentic approach to protecting human rights. Civil society has been very successful with many institutions in the international community. We've seen the European Union across different agencies responding quite well to some of the demands and escalations that civil society made in relation to surveillance technologies, and ban on exports was high on the list. And we yet to see, because this is an ecosystem, it's not just one government, it's not just the one type of agencies, it's not one part of the community that's interested and advocating for the protection of human rights, but every other actor involved in this ecosystem has a responsibility as well. And I think this is why it's important to take the lessons learned and the efficacy and the success that civil society has had with some of these government institutions, and try to persuade it, to pursue it and persuade investors to be a part of the conversation and do take action on that. So in summary, it's creating the common language, expectations, moving away from honorary or ceremonial human rights wavering of their commitments, and actually effectively engaging with some of these challenges and deterring perpetrating violations of human rights.
Thank you. That was a very in-depth response with a lot of important information and a lot of interesting wording actually as well. You touched on things like responsibility and accountability and advancing the debate and creating a common language. There's probably one more element to this whole discussion and building that responsibility and accountability. And when you think about the actual topic or the focus of the guide, surveillance technology, I guess it's fair to say that the civil society and especially the human rights defenders on ground probably feel the chilling effects and adverse impacts brought on by the surveillance much more than most other groups. So another question for you, Nardine, if that's okay, based on your experience, what is the value add from that perspective that the civil society can bring to the investor community? Why should the investors listen to the civil society?
One way of approaching this is actually picking some of the high-profile cases in which we've seen the massive effects of letting these technologies go unaccountable. And so I'd like to start with the researcher at, it was a PhD candidate at Cambridge University, Giulio Regini, who was doing some field work in Egypt, and his phone, some spyware was installed on it. The authorities, Ministry of Interior authorities, were able to track his movements, capture him, and then he was he was under enforced disappearance for quite a while, a few days, until there was a mounting pressure, reports to the Italian embassy about his disappearance. And then it turns out that he was tortured, killed, and thrown on highway for people to find his corpse. And this was not the only jarring example or case that we've had. Of course, in recent memory, we have that of the late murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi from Saudi Arabia. Now, what happened here is that civil society, prior to the murder of Giulio Regini, actually warned against a hacking team, which was the source of the spyware that was installed in his devices. And in March 2014, Privacy International did write to the Italian export authorities to warn them about that. However, the response was too late. It was only after his murder that the Italian export authorities revoked the export license of hacking team. We have many examples of that, where civil society has highlighted some of these drastic implications. In recent years as well, Citizen Lab has detected that Ebtissam al-Sayer who is a human rights advocate in Bahrain, was targeted with NSO, and knowing the background that she received persistent and continuous threats from the Bahraini authorities of defamation and even rape, and just knowing that they have access to her personal data, her personal phone and camera, even augments these threats further. So, even if we put aside the right to privacy and right to safety, that in itself is very serious and drastic. And that was Pegasus spyware from NSO Group based in Israel. Similarly, was the case with Hadib, who's a Jordanian human rights lawyer. And of course, one of the earliest cases that Citizen Lab detected was that of Ahmed Mansour, who's a notable United Arab Emirates human rights defender, and also the board member on a prominent human rights organization, the Gulf Center for Human Rights. Now, with all these examples in mind, it seems that there are some institutions that are listening to civil society, maybe too late, but now the efforts are escalating, particularly to preempt some of these effects. And even if it's like not everyone is going to be targeted and murdered at the end of it, but that induces quite a chilling effect that it prevents anyone from speaking up, from defending human rights, or just even exercising their basic human rights of freedom of thought and expression, not to mention assembly. Now, with these amounting threats, with these very alarming picture, like civil society is now advocating the EU, as well as the EU concerting efforts to advocate to France to deter the sale of surveillance tech to Egypt, particularly the involvement of Sam Vine. It's a very high-profile issue at the moment. And I think we should learn that it's not effective to just to speak to one actor or one type of actors in the ecosystem. It is best to involve as much and as many actors in the process of the preemption, as well as the governance and management of these violations, and try as much as possible to concert the efforts to prevent them. It is not possible to assume that we can completely eradicate it, because even with the other challenges that we see across anti-slavery and other issues, we haven't seen the abolishment of these, unfortunately, yet. However, the aspiration should be towards eliminating it and abolishing it. So that, in a nutshell, is why this is the case for civil society. Most of the examples that I pulled is basically from the Middle East and North African region. I think the examples are quite stark. We did have some collaborators on the guide who were providing examples from Israel and Russia, and it's a very grim and bleak picture as it is in this region. So I think all of these are lessons that we should take, put front and center in deterring furthering the situation from perpetuating more abuse and violations. And particularly that if we look at that type of surveillance that is targeted, it is meant to induce a very intense chilling effect, where everyone becomes effectively in a panoptic context where everyone is just policing themselves. It seems like that is not even enough to quell and constrict the civic space in this region, or even those who still continue to advocate for human rights and rights of minorities. Now, with that, I suppose my concluding remarks would be civil society has a track record of successful collaborations with some parts of the system. However, yet investors are to listen, are to engage, and to authentically participate in the prevention of perpetuating human rights abuses and violations.
Thank you, Nardine. These are certainly very powerful examples. It's difficult to find the right words to really say much more about them, but I guess it's fair to say that these are issues that cannot be solved by one stakeholder group alone, that it really takes that building trust and creating the common narrative and sharing the debates and the dialogue together to try to find solutions, even to mitigate, let alone prevent these issues from happening. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you both, Nardine and Danny, for sharing your insights on the context and the background, and as well as the work that you've done to contribute to the creation of the surveillance guide. But with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Sam for the next discussion, in which, to my understanding, we'll hear directly from the investor community on their initial impressions. So thank you. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much, Laura. So yeah, we're really lucky to be joined today by Rachel Nishimoto, who is the ESG Stewardship Manager for Parnassus Investments, which is based in California. It's definitely going to embarrass her, but she was one of the most thoughtful investor participants during the development of the guide, and as someone who has engaged the information and communication technology sector from where she sits, her inputs were really valuable. So Rachel, I'm going to start off with sort of a level question, and that is, how do you see the role of investors in advancing corporate accountability in the surveillance technology ecosystem?
Thank you, Sam, and thanks for the opportunity to speak with you all today. So as Sam mentioned, I'm Rachel Nishimoto. I work for a mutual fund company based in San Francisco, and we're ESG investors, meaning we incorporate environmental, social, and governance considerations into our investment process and also into our company engagements. And so I had the privilege of attending the learning and development sessions for this surveillance technology guide. I think it was very thoughtfully put together, and just so much expertise from the speakers that you've heard, and so many more from civil society. And I think it's a topic that the investor community really does need awareness and education on, because it's so pervasive in our lives, and by extension in everybody's investment portfolios one way or another. So let me start by providing some context as to kind of where I sit in the investor universe, so to speak. Investors are not a monolith. So there's a huge variety of players in the capital markets. And so kind of the role and the impact that investors can play in advancing corporate accountability and surveillance technology, it really depends on kind of where in the field they sit. So for instance, companies that are publicly traded are subject to very different regulations and disclosure requirements than companies that are privately owned, which can operate much more in the shadows. Within institutional investors in the public markets, you have active like mutual fund managers like Parnassus, where I work, where we select companies to hold in our portfolios, and also companies that we avoid holding in our portfolios. But you also have passive investors like the BlackRocks and the Vanguards, where they have to own the market. So it's not really a choice of stock selection. So there's kind of a different avenue for incorporating these considerations. And then you have asset owners, which are like, the pension funds, who have exposure to both public and private markets, active, passive strategies. And they're often kind of one step removed from direct investment in companies. So where I sit, I work for a US-based active fund manager. So I'm speaking mostly from this perspective. We first and foremost kind of vote with our dollars. And that's really where we choose to invest, where we avoid investing in a company, where we divest from companies, either for financial or for ESG or ethical reasons. And so we purposely avoid investing in companies whose core businesses and core business models are to develop and deploy surveillance technology. That's the easy part, like Palantir's out, right? But beyond that, we're invested in large technology companies that have a huge portfolio of products and services. And a small portion of those can be used for surveillance purposes. So if you think of companies like Microsoft, Apple, Cisco, Alphabet, right? And this is where leveraging our position as investors to raise these issues of surveillance and digital rights with companies come in. And we do this a lot through engagement with companies, either individually or as a coalition of investors, alongside other stakeholders. We can also do this through kind of voicing our vote through proxy voting. So those are kind of a few levers that we have as active managers. But ultimately, if we're invested in a company, it's our responsibility to know the company's products and services, who they're being used by, for what purposes, and to evaluate whether the company is adequately identifying and mitigating human rights risks that could be posed the use of their products, either by design or in certain use cases.
Thanks very much, Rachel. So, something that definitely came up during the development of the guide is this emerging concept known as double materiality, right? Where there is traditional financial materiality related to company risks, but there are emerging environmental, social, and governance risks that would be considered impact materiality. So from your perspective, how do you understand the convergence between the salient human rights risks that Danny and Nardine described and material risks for investors, including what Nardine referred to as sort of an expanding set of regulatory risks created by mandatory human rights due diligence and the GDPR in the EU?
Right, that's a great question, and I'm sure we're all aware that regulation has always struggled to keep up with technological advancements, and it's no different in the case of surveillance technology. And when we talk about the regulatory risk in this context, which is what often gets the attention of investors, I think it's important to bring into the discussion the consideration of artificial intelligence, because we can't really separate surveillance tech from AI, right? They go hand in hand, and I think most in the audience understand this field much deeper than I do. But AI, enables and advances just about every form of surveillance technology that we see proliferating today. Everything from the biometric recognition to tracking, targeted content, targeted advertising, and the regulatory environment is finally starting to catch up. I think we're seeing a lot of signs of that. There's interest and appetite across regions to start regulating AI and its uses in a lot of societal contexts. So the most kind of prominent set of legislation is in Europe, the Broad AI Act. In the US, we're also seeing more interest at both the state and the federal levels to regulate AI in certain uses of it, and to require disclosure from companies that are going to use it. And even in China, there's a new law regulating some uses of AI. So kind of the components of regulation regarding, data privacy, AI, surveillance tech, all of these kind of three sets of rulemaking, I guess, signal to companies, especially large and mega technology companies, that they need to be developing, strengthening, communicating on their policies and actions to uphold human rights in practice throughout product life cycles. And if they're not already moving on this, then they're already behind. And that exposes the company and its investors, by extension, to not only regulatory risk, but business and reputational risk, which is where kind of that materiality piece all comes together. Just kind of one last note on that. The UN last year even called for a moratorium on the sale and use of AI systems that pose severe human rights risks. So, I mean, it's not just regulators, it's kind of, global, like multi-stakeholder organizations that are really paying attention to this. And I think a lot of that is really kind of brought from the awareness that civil society has been pushing for. And so I think really the time is right for investors to start paying attention, as there's a lot of momentum building in this sphere. And I think just a last note is, for investors who are kind of invested in pure play or like major surveillance tech companies, relying solely on governments to impose sanctions or export restrictions, it's almost always too little too late. By then, you've already lost capital. The business relationships and like product uses that companies maintain are generally already public, either through media or like civil society reports. Like a lot of the revelations on spying that this community has brought to light. So I think the risks are usually pretty well known ahead of government action. So kind of I think it's to the disadvantage of investors to kind of sit and wait for those types of government actions alone. Like, it requires a lot of kind of proactive diligence and homework.
Thanks very much for that. I think to that point, Nardine had mentioned NSO Group in her comments. An NSO Group, perhaps better than no other company out there, represents the convergence between salient human rights risk and financial material risk. I mean, after the incredible research, analysis, and advocacy that was done by civil society around the group, you had blacklisting by the U.S. Commerce Department, lawsuits by Apple and WhatsApp against the company that really is hopefully resulting in their financial collapse. But beyond those groups in the headlines like NSO Group or Celebrate, Rachel, how do you think that investors can be unknowingly exposed to risk associated with the surveillance technology ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think a lot of kind of the main actors or offenders that we're talking about, a lot of these companies are privately owned. They're not beholden to public investors. And so kind of the level of accountability is very different. But the vast majority of investors own shares in the world's largest technology companies. And that's, like I mentioned, the Microsofts, the Amazons, Facebook, Apple, Alphabet. And though none of these companies specialize specifically in surveillance technology as a core business, they are all exposed to it, or they're all part of the surveillance tech ecosystem in some way, right? And so most investors have those companies in their portfolios. Aside from kind of large tech, investing in holding companies or investment companies like a SoftBank or a Berkshire Hathaway will expose an investor to the assets and investments that those companies hold, right? And I mean, just another quick note on like the blue chip tech stocks is oftentimes they have their own investment or capital venture arms, like Microsoft and IBM. I mean, there's a pretty kind of high profile story last year or the year before on Microsoft kind of stepping away from AnyVision, which was a surveillance tech company based in Israel that was kind of associated with some human rights risk. And so, kind of indirectly through the main companies that most people have in their portfolios, there is exposure to this ecosystem. And so for investors, especially for actively managed funds, like a lot of mutual funds, to diligence each portfolio holding and understand like what you're owning when you deploy capital is really critical to just, identifying where your exposure and your risks could be, and then kind of using those bits of information to inform engagement or dialogue with the companies that you own.
Thank you very much. We definitely want to get to audience questions, so we'll just Rachel will finish up with one final one. So both at Parnassus and perhaps more broadly in the socially responsible investment community, what do you see as the main obstacles for advancing accountability for surveillance-related human rights harms, and how can the guide overcome some of these challenges?
Sure. I mean, when we talk about surveillance, I mean, surveillance by nature is meant to be concealed, right? Like the whole purpose is to keep hidden from your target that they're being surveilled or tracked, or the extent to which you're collecting their information or tracking them. And so this whole ecosystem often becomes even more secretive if there are government entities or government contracts involved. So I think for investors who do have a mission or commitment to respecting human rights in their investments, the first and like biggest obstacle is transparency of information to, first and foremost, inform risk management and investment decision making. And I think that's where human rights due diligence for the investor comes in, and it's really important. And that's where the guide provides a useful framework for evaluating the components of the company's human rights policies, but also its impacts. And so, at a foundational level, the guide kind of starts with, what are the governance and policies a company has in place? Like, is there even a human rights policy at this company? What is it aligned to? Is the company committed to the UN guiding principles? What's the scope of the policy? How is it implemented? How is it operationalized? Who's even accountable? Is there anyone held accountable? Like, are there risk assessments? How often? To what extent? Which stakeholders are consulted? How are harms identified? How are remedies identified? This whole kind of product life cycle of diligence is kind of the onus of the investor, right? And these are questions that have to be answered if an investor is going to have confidence that a company that we invest in is committed to upholding human rights, especially in their downstream impacts. And if it's a question mark or gaps are identified, then we also have a role to play in pressing for improvement. It's been said earlier, and I'll just end by saying that effective engagement with companies is really not a two-party conversation between investors and companies. It really has to be a multi-stakeholder approach. Investors a lot of times are thought of like the stakeholder with the most leverage, because as a shareholder, we literally own a piece of the company. And sometimes that makes companies more open to inviting a dialogue, starting a dialogue. But oftentimes investors are not the subject matter experts on things like human rights harms from surveillance technology or AI. Like, I am certainly not a subject matter expert compared to everybody else on this call working on these issues full time. So the voice of other stakeholders is so important to inform what best practices are, what impacts, and what change really looks like on the ground, what impacts are actually felt by the communities that products and services are used on. And that kind of broader voice is really important to represent a perspective outside a lens that is usually focused on financial returns and shareholder value. So really, it's I can't emphasize enough like the value of the multi-stakeholder approach, and I think this guide is really valuable in kind of presenting that lens and connecting it to kind of a business case of why investors should care and should pursue these issues with the companies that they deploy capital to.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you especially for touching on what was an objective of the development of the guide, which was really serving as a bridging exercise between civil society organizations that have the most in-depth research and analysis of the actual human impacts of surveillance technologies with investors who are, I think we would argue, an untapped set of potential change agents, although certainly, as pointed out, the responsibility doesn't rest on your shoulders alone. So going to the first question from the audience, and I'll open this up to any of my fellow panelists. How can governments encourage collaboration between civil society groups and investors? And what is their own role in the process of regulating the surveillance industry? I'm assuming by own the government's role itself. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for that one? I think you're muted, Dan.
Sorry, I also saw that Nardine has also wants to say something, but just to say something related to that question is that so many countries, states, right, have like their national actions plans regarding to human rights, and I think that governments can encourage the collaboration between civil society groups and investors and also other private actors when they develop these plans, also thinking in business and human rights and the different multi-stakeholders, as Rachel mentioned, the important that they all collaborate in try to see how they can address certain human rights harms and risk. And also in this case, when we're talking about how we can enroll these actors in the process of regulating the surveillance industry, that is, for example, one space where, for example, could all these stakeholders engage, and taking into consideration that that is an important role from the government to think and develop these action plans, doing this more inclusive to different actors. Also, so that's could be one answer to that, right?
Thanks, Danny. I think one way of also answering this is first asking which governments. So if we mean the oppressive and authoritarian governments, they have extensive systems of legal as well as policing that make it very difficult to hold the government itself accountable, but anyone else who uses similar technologies for monitoring people at the workplace, for instance, or making sure that no filtered content is accessed, or like something as what Amazon does by filtering workers' complaints and the speech that they, the kind of discourse and speech they have control of over. It's no longer as free. So governments in the region prevent all of these uses, and they have extensive legal and policing systems to vindicate it. So that's for the governments that actually violate human rights, as well as for the other governments, that we hold with high regard in the international community to promote democracy and protect human rights. Long Society has long advocated that these democracies, particularly ones where cyber surveillance or cyber security technology companies are exporting from, the governments themselves have a liability based on that vision of protecting democracy, promotion, as well as human rights in other countries, to not allow the export of these surveillance technologies. And so what we see as a way around this is that instead of just exporting a product or the infrastructure, which is what's happening in Egypt with Sandvine, that they're rolling the infrastructure for mass surveillance. And that's why when France comes forward and says that they're selling more surveillance technologies to Egypt, it's really raising a red flag here. So on that note, these governments have a commitment. We appeal to that. We're trying to persuade it and hold governments accountable by that standard. And then I suppose it's how can you encourage collaboration? It seems like it's a deadlock with authoritarian governments because pressure has to come from more powerful actors than civil society, which is already under a lot of restraint and restrictions, if not targeting and intimidation, which is often the case. So what happens is that the other governments are creating a lot of mechanisms and channels for communication, channels for listening to grievances and for evidence submission and resolving these in some sorts. But oftentimes it's a matter of coming up with a resolution or a conclusion or a recommendation or a moratorium that is not binding, and we see it violated one time after another. So time and again, we don't see any effective action taken, but the very idea that it's made a statement, it becomes a part of international customary law, and it becomes a stronger case for civil society to appeal to it. So I don't know if it's a very definitive answer, but that's one way of looking at it, that there are different types of governments involved and different types of collaborations involved. One being very little to non-existent, and another is actually setting the standards for the cases to make forward in the future.
Thanks so much, Nardine. And you actually led us very nicely into the next question, which is the problem of regulation, norms, and guidance is that they are often non-binding. So how can investors and add to that, companies be held accountable? Anyone who would like to answer that?
Sure, I can take a stab at it. I'm seeing a trend in accountability here, and that's obviously a problem across the entire ecosystem. That's how it can proliferate in the first place. As far as investors being held accountable, I think there is more scrutiny these days on investors who claim to either have kind of an ESG or responsible investment mandate, but maybe their portfolios hold companies that are generally controversial for one reason or another. There's increasing scrutiny from the SEC in the United States for fund managers who claim ESG mandates to prove that they're actually doing what they say they're doing. So I think there is a sense of kind of regulatory scrutiny on investors to kind of, if they claim to be doing a certain set of due diligence and applying standards to their portfolios, that they're actually doing it and being able to prove it to their stakeholders. For Parnassus specifically, we have shareholders that are very they're very interested in basically how we do ESG, what it looks like in practice, and we get questions, and that is a mechanism of accountability of like, prove to me that you know why you hold this company, what the risks are, how you're mitigating them. So I think a lot of it is that the accountability is from your customers, and I think people kind of voting with their feet and their dollars is like the most one of the most effective tools, but also there is a regulatory component as well.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And then the final question from the audience, and this is something that Heartland and any number of others that we've worked with have struggled to answer. Does the fear of reputational risk truly have an impact on companies and investors? Anyone would like to take that one?
I would say it depends. It depends on, for companies, it depends on who's kind of the loudest in their ear, and which stakeholders they value the most. If you look at a publicly traded company where a lot of their large shareholders are kind of advocating and pressing on one issue, then a company's going to feel a lot of pressure to move. If it's a controlled company where kind of your shareholders don't really have a voice, then I would say the pressure is less. But I mean, I think going back to kind of the previous comment, if on the side of investors, there is a component of reputational risk, right? It's a competitive landscape, and at least for us, if we don't offer the value to our shareholders that we promise, then investors will leave. And that's the same for companies, I think. And it's not only kind of from a financial standpoint, but it's also kind of living up to the commitments that you publicly put out there to respect human rights, to respect environmental protection, things like that. So I think there is also a point in time where if a reputational risk becomes so large and kind of prominent, it crosses over from, it's not just reputational anymore, it actually affects your bottom line, it affects your ability to attract capital, it affects your ability to attract employees. And that's when you kind of really see companies pressured to move, is when you can no longer just say, oh, this is just a reputational risk, it's going to pass with the headlines.
Thank you for that, Rachel. And I would say, I mean, I would echo that it's really situational dependent. I mean, one of the examples that's often used is Facebook in Myanmar, when the platform was rightfully accused of inciting hatred and the online hatred leading to real-world violence against the Rohingya minority, and conducted a human rights impact assessment in the aftermath under pressure from shareholders and civil society alike. But I would also agree that it's most effective when companies are at least perceiving or evaluating that reputational risk has turned into financial risk. The recent coup in Myanmar, with an array of sanctions, with tremendous reporting, research analysis, especially by groups from Myanmar, really converged to create legal, operational, financial, and certainly reputational risk. And that's why it's critical that any advocacy effort, whether it's country or issue specific, is really a multitude of approaches that involve advocacy, strategic litigation, engagement with investors, and certainly either campaigns or constructive engagement with companies. Nardine, you said you wanted to add one more piece to that, please.
Just something very contextual, and I think it flows from Myanmar as well, because often the case, repressive governments in the MENA region, they justify the import as well as the development and deployment of surveillance technologies in their counterterrorism efforts, which can sound like a very hard to dispute case or claim. However, knowing that they have a track record of violating human rights, of targeting key journalists, human rights defenders, or academics, and even citizens that are just calling out corruption, it makes a very strong case to fear that actually, if the fear of reputation is not a good deterrent, then it's very difficult to accept the case that we have companies that are and people that are investing in companies that are actively abusing human rights in different regions across the world.
That's an excellent point. I would just add to that, one of the dominant themes that has come up with the Russian invasion of Ukraine is this idea of companies working with authoritarians and autocrats, and that there are certain foreseeable risks in companies, whether it's in market entry or market exit, risks around working with these rights violating states. And so one specific request of companies that we and others are making, and a lot of investors are making, is around know your customer due diligence. In other words, what processes do you have in place as a company that assesses working with those working with rights violating states and their affiliated companies, and not just talking about sanctions or export controls compliance, but looking at civil society documentation of rights violating records. So with that in mind, and looking at the time, I think we're going to wrap this up. I again want to thank the Montreal Institute for the invitation to participate. I would also encourage those on the call, if you're working on particular companies with surveillance related risk, please don't hesitate to get in touch with Heartland Initiative to help participate in some of the company engagements that we've got going on. And I also wanted to mention that Heartland works across sectors, extractives, renewables, et cetera. And one of our main functions is really connecting civil society organizations that do the work of documenting the human cost of surveillance tech, extractive activities, et cetera, with investors that are leading these engagements. So please get in touch with us, and thanks everyone very much for your time.